Tuskegee Airmen.
We flew over 200 bomber escort missions. We've never lost a bomber to enemy air action.
There was a time not long ago when the United States did not allow all men to fly for their country simply because of their race.
There were so many comments that we couldn't do this or we couldn't do that. And you say, well, we can do it.
What are you black people doing here? Why don't you go home? Get on the next boat and go back. This was the type of propaganda that we did get.
They proved that the human spirit cannot be bound by what others believe.
There's no such thing as segregation when you're fighting side by side.
Trained in a small town in deep Alabama, these men were part of a program that the very people who created it expected to fail. They were wrong. The Tuskegee Airmen prevailed.
We all had the attitude that we want to fly for America and fight for America.
We were in a war effort, and together and jointly, we were making our contributions.
None of us thought that we were heroes. We had a job to do, and it was a tough job.
There were no others who had gone before, at whose trail they could glance and say, this is the way. There was no map for success, except one drawn by faith that they knew they were worthy.
Ours was the Tuskegee experience.
This is a story of heroes who wanted to fly. The year is 1943, and the world finds itself in its second all-out war. Despite 4 years of Allied resistance, Hitler and his cronies still hold the bulk of Europe hostage. That May, in French Morocco, on a patch of grass at the foot of the Atlas Mountains, a recently arrived combat fighter squadron from America prepares for combat. The U.S. Army Air Force's 99th Fighter Squadron has a feature that distinguishes it, ground crew to pilots, from all others. It is the first all-black Air Force combat unit, and just getting to the war zone was a battle in itself.
The Army Air Corps was going to send the 99th to Liberia. And really and truly what they were doing was avoiding a relationship between black Air Corps people and white Air Corps people. There were the North African landings on 11 November 1942. But the minute that that happened, it meant that Liberia was out of the question because there was no reason to have any Army Air Corps capability in Liberia. I'm sure the messages ran hot between the Pacific and Washington and between Washington and Europe.
The Army's answer was to send the 99th to French Morocco until they could figure out what to do with it.
We were very fortunate. Your newspaper comics, Flip Cochran, he was actually a real live individual, and he was our theater indoctrination officer. He had become very famous with his ability in the P-40, and he gave us all of the tips on dive bombing, desert operation, combat formation flying, different from that we had practiced and learned in the States.
The squadron moved to the Cape Bon Peninsula in Tunisia on their way to their first combat mission.
We were isolated. You didn't know what was happening, so the BBC was our source of information. We also came across Axis Sally on one of the radio bands, and of course she was asking the great question, what are you black people doing here? You're going to fight and die for a country that really doesn't appreciate you and doesn't want you. So what are you doing here? Why don't you go home?
Black Americans have given their lives to every major conflict in their country's history. Even so, they'd never enjoyed the freedom promised by its victories, nor the respect due to their efforts. When aircraft were first used substantially in World War I, it was thought in the United States that blacks did not have the intelligence or courage to fly them. The only American black man to fly in World War I did so for another country. France's Black Swallow of Death, Eugene Jacques Bullard's fuselage, carried the slogan, "All blood runs red." Despite earning the highest French medals for valor, he was still denied entrance into the U.S. Army Air Service. As World War II approached, attitudes had not changed. The accomplishments of early black aviators such as Bessie Coleman, Willa Brown, and Cornelius Coffey were ignored. So were men such as Dr. Albert E. Forsyth and C. Alfred Anderson, who were making record-breaking cross-country flights.
There had been a study completed in 1925 by the Army War College based on supposedly an evaluation of the performance of Negroes in World War I. And in a very biased manner, they reached decisions that the Negro was inferior, innately inferior. He did not have the flexibility or the dexterities to operate something as complicated as an aircraft.
The 1925 Army War College study gave the U.S. War Department the justification for keeping blacks in the mess halls and road-building units of the military. The pseudoscience of this study would soon be put to the test. With war brewing in Europe, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt began to provide for a national defense buildup. In 1939, he implemented a plan for the Civil Aviation Authority's civilian pilot training program. The CPTP would train 20,000 college students per year for private flight level licenses. Of those 20,000, none hailed from the nation's historically black colleges.
For no real reason that I know, my father took me to Bowling Air Force Base to put me in an airplane. All I do know is that now that he paid $5 for my ride, and $5 was rather a substantial sum of money.
I was living in Staunton, Virginia. You know, back in those days, there were barnstormers who were flying around, and I'd heard about them, and I always wanted to see an airplane because I was always curious about what was on either side of those Blue Ridge Mountains. I continued to run away from home to try to find these airplanes.
As a kid, I used to collect baseball cards. I used to collect airplane cards. I still can't remember what I got them out of, but one of my walls was completely covered with airplanes, from the old Spaz up until the newest planes in production at that time. I've always been fascinated with flying, and that's all I've ever really wanted to do was fly.
A black lobbyist for government employees, Edgar G. Brown, arranged for two young black pilots to fly from Chicago to Washington to meet a little-known U.S. Senator from Missouri. Harry S. Truman was so amazed after meeting Chauncey Spencer and Dale White that he was heard to say, "If you guys had guts enough to fly that from Chicago, I got guts enough to do all I can to help you." With new allies on Capitol Hill, hope began to emerge for inclusion in the civilian pilot training program for blacks. The political pressure succeeded. Congress authorized additional funds for the training of black pilots in the CPT program at 5 historically black colleges.
Left out Hampton. They say we were the agitators. So we had to go back and fight again. And in a few weeks, they had approved putting the program into Hampton Institute.
Also added to the original list was Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, the school originally founded by Booker T. Washington as a vocational college for young black men and women.
At that time, there was no thought whatsoever in my mind about the military, because most of us understood that the Army Air Corps positively was not accepting any applications of blacks for the aviation cadet pilot training program.
Tuskegee President Dr. Frederick Patterson wanted his program to be a success. He enlisted the help of aviation pioneer C. Alfred Chief Anderson to head the flight instruction program. On July 29, 1940, Chief Anderson flew low over the Institute in a new 225 horsepower Waco, tail number NC20970, painted in Army Air Corps blue and yellow. Despite the promise of his plane's colors, the chief's instruction would only be for civilian training. The training of black military pilots was still being denied by the War Department, despite the passage of Public Law 18 by Congress, which made provisions for such training. Resources for the Air Corps, the gem of the Army, could only go to white men. Short on funds, Tuskegee Institute appealed to the Julius Rosenwald Fund of Chicago, which in 1941 held its annual meeting at Tuskegee. Among its board members was a strong-willed woman from a powerful family who also happened to be the First Lady of the United States. Hearing of Tuskegee's problems, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt decided to enhance her understanding of the situation with a visit to the airfield.
I remember the first thing she said when she got out there was, I always heard that colored people couldn't fly airplanes, but I see you flying all around here. We had several airplanes out there, including advanced training and whatnot. She said, I'm just going to take a ride with you. Then everybody naturally got upset, you know, and told me, you can't do that, Mrs. Roosevelt. And so she was a woman who decided when she made a decision, she did what she wanted to do. She went on climbing in the airplane, said, let's go. So while we're up, we had a very interesting conversation, and she told me that she was interested in flying, that she'd like to fly herself. Amelia Earhart was going to give her flight instruction. And when I got back, said, well, she can fly all right.
Funds were promptly loaned to the Institute to upgrade their airport. Within months of these improvements, Mrs. Roosevelt's husband revised national policy to assure the training of black fighter pilots. It was decided to establish the 99th Pursuit Squadron at Tuskegee on a new airfield to be built there. In October of 1941, the first black enlisted members of the 99th Pursuit Squadron arrived via train at Chehaw Station. The first pilot class, 42C, consisted of 12 cadets and a student officer. The one student officer, West Point graduate Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., was the son of the Army's only black general, Benjamin O. Davis, Sr.
In those days, a West Point cadet really was somebody. And that's why I had the view that if I became a graduated cadet, nobody was going to stop me in my desire to fly airplanes. So I went to West Point.
The cadets at West Point did their best to discourage young Davis by giving him a silent treatment in which not a word was spoken to him outside of official duties in all of the 4 years he attended. But they could not stop him, nor would those in the Air Corps who hoped to keep him from flying once he was commissioned.
Evidently, they had a rule for all of their flight surgeons to find reasons to fail black applicants. And the flight surgeon at Fort Riley failed me. The Army immediately picked me up, put me in an airplane, took me to Maxwell Field. I passed the examination, and I was transferred to Tuskegee Institute to attend the first class of black students at the newly established Tuskegee Army Airfield.
In Alabama, Jim Crow segregation was still an unchallenged way of life. As the recruits from the North got off their respective trains, they knew that there would be more to this experience than just learning to fly.
It was a terrific shock, traumatic, I might say, when I got down to Alabama. I'd never been south of Washington before. And when I saw the environment down there, I began to think immediately of all the stories I'd heard about lynchings, and I could see that this was an ideal environment for such a thing.
Those of us, those Southern cadets. Our argument would be that you have no more privileges, no more opportunities in Washington, Chicago, Detroit, New York than we have here. You are a Negro, and wherever you are going to be treated, and you have no more privileges than any other second-class citizen. And that's what you are, and that's how you're treated anywhere in these United States.
We found that through some media or something that we found, that we were referred to as smart niggers. And being referred to as that, we found great support in each other because we had the proper academic backgrounds to live above that sort of thing. It's just that we were so socially segregated that we had to depend on each other for moral support. That's how we were able to go on. Otherwise, many of us would not have been able to endure the pressure that we stood there.
And that pressure was intense. From the first days of the program, there was more than the usual amount of transitioning from civilian to military life.
Your room was never perfect. I don't care how tight the blankets were on the bed or how dust-free your shoes were under the bed. They could always find something to give you a demerit for. I think quite often it was really personal in that these tactical officers vented their feeling about the Army Air Corps accepting these blacks into their training program.
Attempts to break the cadets and the program were apparently encouraged by his first commander, Colonel Frederick von Kimball, a West Point graduate himself. With 24 years of flying experience, he enthusiastically supported segregation of the races.
Actually, I was not too much enthusiastic about those officers over there at the Army Airfield because I knew that a lot of them had no sympathy for what we were doing.
Even with Kimball trying to subvert their efforts, the men toughing it out were receiving first-class training from their flying instructors.
I was impressed with the program, and I think the instruction was excellent. I think the equipment was well maintained. This has a lot to do with your confidence in learning to fly. If you have confidence in the gear, or the equipment, and you have confidence in the instructor, success is almost inherent.
The training at Tuskegee Army Airfield by the instructors that they sent there was the equal of whatever was going on in San Antonio at Randolph Field or any other flying school operated by the Army Air Corps.
It would be Captain Davis who would be the first black officer to officially solo in an Army Air Corps aircraft.
That was on 2 September 1941. It was a thrill only because there was nobody in the back seat of the airplane. But I was alone in the air, and that was still, it is a thrill.
Although the airmen were training for combat, the United States was technically at peace. Things changed quickly when on December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft bombed Pearl Harbor. America entered the war against the Axis powers.